Welcome back to Family History Fridays with the Butler Area Public Library. I'm Margaret, and in this video, we are going to do a basic overview of passenger lists for immigration research. Before digging into your ancestry research in terms of immigration, you should know that not all passenger lists are created equal. Now, there are three main eras of immigration in which passenger lists change. So the first is before 1820, the second is from 1820 until 1890, and the third era of documentation is from 1891 into the 1950s. So in this first era, before 1820, there was no requirement that passenger lists be recorded or submitted anywhere by colonial or federal law. So the lists that do survive and that were made in that era are not always consistently documented, and they're not consistently available for us today for research. And often you're going to have to rely on transcriptions or indexes that have been compiled after the fact to try and help out genealogy researchers. If you do get lucky and find an actual image of a passenger manifest, it's probably going to be something like this. So this is a manifest coming into the port of Philadelphia on the brig Juno in February of 1800. And we can see that the primary purpose for this document is to record the packages and contents of material that have been shipped into the US. So we have, this boat was coming out of Bremen, so we have indication that they have chests of German linen, German oilcloth, and 2,000 bricks. And then below that, we have our passengers. And if we blow this up here, we can see that all we have is a list of about 10 people. We don't have any further identifying information about where they came from or their ages, other than a notation here that these two were children. So maybe we can infer, based on the fact that some of these folks are sharing surnames, we can see two here with the surname Apple, that maybe that is a couple or some kind of family unit, but there's not a lot here to work with in terms of research material. And more often than not, what you are going to find are books that have been compiled from lists like that, that are transcriptions of the information. So here we can see, relevant to immigrants coming into Boston in 1768, this boat that arrived in January, that we have a few people, we have their names, and we do have an occupation. So we have Patrick Connor, a laborer, Mrs. Elizabeth Deacon, wife of a schoolmaster, and her three children who are not named. And then on another ship that arrived, we have some farmers. Here's another list. This one is arrivals into Boston from February of 1768. And you can see that we have some mariners, and then we have some individuals. We have a Lieutenant William Haswell and his daughter and a maid, again, unnamed. We don't have ages, and we don't know, other than departing from London, where these folks came from beforehand. So again, you are not going to have a ton of information available both to match this to your ancestors or to connect them to their homeland before they came to the United States. Now, after 1820, our documents change a little bit because the United States now requires that customs passenger lists be filed. These are going to be lists of people getting on the ship that are compiled before or at departure. And the questions that are asked are standardized for the most part, but they're going to be limited. So we're really only going to get name, age, sex, and occupation, the country of last residence, and the country of destination. So here's one example. This is a passenger list for Boston on a ship called the Leviathan that arrived in 1828. We can see just 4 people being recorded here on this boat. And we can see, for example, the third person on the line, William Quinlan. He's 26 and a laborer. He came from Ireland, and his destination is simply USA. So there's, again, more information than we had in the early days of the United States, but still not a lot to work with. A second example, this is from the port of New York from August of 1859. And again, you can see that we're recording names, ages, occupations. This very first person on the top, Max Green, is a 31-year-old merchant from the United States returning to the United States. But further down, we have some folks who are immigrants. So here we can see Julie Hartzog, who's 29. She's unmarried, she's from Germany, and then they've just filled in a big, huge written United States for final destination. Finally, starting in 1891 is when we get better documentation. Now these records are going to be known as immigration lists, and they are going to be recording a lot more information about the persons coming into the US. So in addition to the standard questions about their name, their age, and their occupation, we're going to ask people if they can read or write. We are going to find out their nationality and their race. We'll know their last residence and a more specific final destination rather than just United States. And they will also be asking if they already have a ticket to said destination. We are also going to ask these persons who paid for the trip, if they've been in the US before, and who they're going to be joining in the United States. So now we are getting a lot more identifying information to help us in our research. So here's an example. This is a passenger manifest from the Princess Alice, which sailed from Bremen to New York in 1904. And at this point, you're going to find that not only have our questions been expanded, but our form has been standardized. So you are going to see this exact passenger manifest sheet, regardless of if your immigrant is coming into New York or if it's a lesser used port like Boston or Philadelphia. So let's zoom in here and take a look at some of these questions and their answers. So we're going to look at the individual that is number 2 on this list. So we have a 31-year-old single man named Jan Kotulski. He's a farmer. He can read and write. He is from Galicia, which we know was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he's Polish. His last residence was in Lukovic, which is in Poland. It's in the south of Poland. So we already then with that have an avenue to pursue records for him pre-immigration in Europe. And we know that his final destination is Fall River, Massachusetts. Continuing on to the second section at the bottom of the screen there, they ask him if he has a ticket from New York to his final destination, and he says no, he does not yet. He paid for this passage himself. He currently has $12 with him. He's never been in the United States before. And then they ask if you're coming to join a relative or friend, and if so, their name and address. So we know he is coming to meet a friend in Massachusetts. It looks like his name is Anthony Netchink, and he lives at 185 Palmer Street. So this gives us an individual to research who probably has connections to the same place in Poland. It gives us an address to find a neighborhood that our individual may have spent some time in after immigrating. And then within these documents where we have a much richer picture being depicted in these questions that we ask, things can even improve a little bit more. So after 1906, our immigration list, our passenger manifest will now be 2 pages. And in addition to everything that we just saw on that manifest, we add a few more questions. That includes if they do say yes, that they've previously been in the United States, where were they and how long did they stay? The name and address of a relative in their homeland, a physical description, and their place of birth. So here is an example. This is a manifest for the Praetorian, which sailed from Glasgow in November of 1909. This is the first page, and it continues onto this second page here. We can see then that it arrived in Boston. So certainly make sure if from 1906 towards the present, if you have immigration records you're looking at, that you look for that second page because you could be missing a lot of information. Let's zoom in here and take a look. So we can see in this line that I've highlighted, we have a 22-year-old single man named James E. Burns. He's a bricklayer. He can read and write, and he is a Scotsman from Scotland. His last permanent residence was in Scotland, a town called Kilmarnock. And then in column 11, where he says name and complete address of nearest relative or friend in the country he is leaving, he says his father, David Burns, with an address of 9 Arbuckle Street in Kilmarnock. So if we didn't know, if we do know that this individual is the person I'm researching, but we didn't know who his father was, this is a great clue and a great way to make that leap overseas to connect generations. In terms of final destination, he says he's going to Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And then we get these new supplemental questions that are added after 1906. So we have his height. We know he was 5'10", had a darker complexion with dark hair and brown eyes. He had no identifying marks. There's just a little DO ditto for no marks going down that line. And then lastly, his place of birth was again in Kilmarnock. So it looks like he probably spent his entire life in that town before coming to the United States. But it's possible you could get an answer where the place of birth answer on the second page is different from the last residence. So you want to make sure you're comparing those to make sure you have all of your bases covered when you are looking to do overseas research. Now, all of these have been for passengers inbound into the United States. And what about outbound passengers? Well, there has never been a requirement to compile a list of outbound passengers or to turn them in anywhere. So that is really just going to be a void in your research. So if you have a relative who did leave but then return, you'll find their re-entry recorded on another manifest, and you may find multiple passenger lists. And this includes US citizens, so it could be that you have an ancestor who simply went on an overseas trip, or you might have an immigrant ancestor who came in, they left and went back overseas to collect other family members or just simply to visit and then returned. So you could find them listed multiple times, but you won't be able to identify the dates of departure from the United States. So now that we know our eras of documentation for passenger lists, how do we find these records? A good place is online. So there are digitized copies of these passenger lists that we've been seeing and digitized indexes available for you on Ancestry or through the library's Ancestry Library Edition. There are also many passenger lists available on Family Search. And for passenger manifests specific to the Port of New York, starting in 1820, you can go to statueofliberty.org. There's also a lot of print resources to help you when you are looking for immigration info. We have a number at the library. Some are very broad general indexes, like the multi-volume Passenger and Immigration Index. But sometimes there are book series that are specific to country of origin. So a series like Germans to America or Italians to America. Or there will be port-specific books. So for example, I have a number of books here at the library, like Ship Passenger Lists, Pennsylvania and Delaware, 1641 to 1825, in which the compiler has attempted to collect and index all of these early scattered piecemeal passenger lists in those early eras. So I hope this has been helpful for you in understanding what is available to you in terms of passenger lists in your research, and happy researching.